Hey, welcome back to the Progressive Brothers podcast. This is episode 37. I'm here with my co-host, Renaissance Man.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. Please like the video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and welcome back.
Also follow us on Twitter at brothers_podcast. So, critical race theory, CRT, is in the news and has been trending for some weeks now, going into 2 seasons, from spring to summer, and really kind of came from the outlandish remarks from the previous president back in September 2020, where you had the president of the United States saying he was going to ban it from being taught, in diversity and inclusion training, on the federal side and within federal agencies, to employees that work for the government. What's your thoughts on critical race theory at this juncture, in this time?
It's been politicized completely. It's become the tool of the right. I'm trying to think of what comes to mind recently that's sort of been co-opted. I mean, historically, if you could say, wedge issues like abortions or, like stem cell research, those type of hot button issues. This is becoming, it kind of reminds me a little bit of when Obama was running for president, the whole Jeremiah Wright situation. That one died down pretty quick because Obama was able to give one speech and it kind of smoothed everything over. But the same intent was there of, hey, let's take something out of context and present it as some radical idea or ideology and not really try to understand it. And then let's associate it with, people who are running for president, in that case, Obama, or more general with Democrats with CRT. Except with this time, they're trying to basically turn it into a tool where you can't have a conversation about race at all. That's where it's really gone. It's not even about a true understanding of what it is, the legal theory behind it, the scholarship, how to properly interpret and use it. It's just anything that can be considered uncomfortable, that could challenge the establishment, make people have to look at a place for reform. All of those things basically is what they're, all-encompassing CRT with now. It's just basically, like I said, a weaponized term that you use to shut down any sort of discourse on race altogether.
Yeah, and that's why it's important, to have pushback. I think healthy pushback is necessary at this point in order to correct the record. A lot of times, you hear a lot of white people. I can understand why white people on the right or who consider themselves conservative as to why they would actually object to CRT or critical race theory. But for black people, I don't get what that's about, right? A lot of them would try to say, well, it's Marxism or it came from Marxism. And so all of these sort of terms, Marxism, socialism, communism, critical race theory, mask wearing, COVID, Muslim, Islam, all of these sort of things get, states' rights, the border, all of these things get sort of, I guess, mixed in a way that allows them to think that anything that they can't interpret is somehow bad. It's so bad to the point that they want to ban it and get rid of it, but they want to preserve their right to have this sort of freedom of thought, freedom of speech, but everybody else is not allowed to have that. And so the reason why they kind of conflate Marxism with CRT or critical race theory is because of the Communist Party in the 1930s. In the 1940s were very prominent, right? Because before World War II, you had these sort of uprisings, plus the economic downturn in the 1920s with the market crash allowed different sort of groups to to be, I guess, grass-rooted in a way that allowed them to look at things from a different lens, right? Economically speaking, and then thinking about this from a justice and social structure reform as well, that they're looking at society different, American society different, and that they're trying to come up with ways to actually move away from a system that is really fragile. And you see that being manifested in the thought processes of white conservatives who are also fragile, that any sort of term that is foreign to them is somehow is so bad that they immediately just flick, right? The snowflake theory and whatnot. And so critical race theory, the conflation of Marxism and critical race theory would have legitimacy if they actually understood communism as a foundational principle for social structures and running your society. But I don't really hear that, and so it's not really consistent. It's consistent for them to say it, but it doesn't have any consistency to include communism and critical race theory, because one is a way of how you look at the legal structures of American society and its impact on those who are outside of the in-group, right? Black people would be considered outside of the in-group for all intents and purposes, the Negro, right? But communism really has nothing to do with it. But because there are two isms that they don't like, critical race theory, communism, socialism, Marxism, they can throw all these terms out there and try to cobble them together to try to make one solid argument that all of these things are just bad because it's on the left, or it came from the left, or we perceive it to be on the left, and something needs to be done about it. But I want to preserve my rights, my constitutional rights, but your constitutional rights, you don't have constitutional rights. And so the battle is what I'm saying here is that the battle for all of this is about who's an American citizen and who has legitimate rights within this country. And what they see is that people on the left, or what they consider to be on the left, don't have legitimacy in American society in proximity to them, basically.
Yeah. With people on the right, there seems to be this, and truth be told, this is typical. It's typical in two ways. The charge of Marxism has always been leveled by the far right at any sort of social movement that really they didn't disagree with. I mean, the same charge was leveled at the civil rights movement. Any sort of the same thing with South Africa. When you look at the end of apartheid, everything was leveled. That has always been a classic go-to. Is that whatever social movement has been infused with Marxism, and that's why it should be deposed. So that's a typical point there. And then when you also look at the idea of basically trying to ignore a problem, that's been a historical theme throughout this country's history, especially when it pertains to race. There's been this, essentially it's been deny, act like it doesn't exist, act like problems don't exist, and then you have a watershed moment, most recently like a George Floyd. Something else that comes to mind is obviously some of the other high-profile police shootings, as well as like when you go back to I think the late 90s, like a James Byrd type of incident. You have these flashpoints of instances where it's just undeniable, the bias, and you get this major response, and people try to window dress and push the reform. But for the most part, that seems to be the cycle. But to me, when you bring up CRT again, it's them going back that same cycle of, hey, okay, let's deny and act like there's no problems. Because when you look at something that's like CRT and the ideology, that's when you start getting into things, the disparities that are within society, systemic disparities, racism within different industries and fields. It's all these issues that people don't want to deal with. Because of perceived loss of privilege, at least on their end. So that's their response. And then for people who are black and who react like this, I think I think they have bought into this sort of colorblind view of the world, or that's what you're striving towards, and that's what CRT actually rejects, is that colorblind view. It basically says you can't, if you have color blindness, then you can't really adequately have social justice, because in order to have true social justice, you need to be able to look at color and put things in place to reform the wrongs of the past. And I think with them, you know, they've moved towards that whole colorblind concept so much that they don't want to move away from that, because in their mind, it may feel like it's going backwards.
Yeah, and class collaboration has been a hallmark of American history, right? Because you think about the United States today, but previously the 13 colonies or the 17 colonies at the time, those people who came here and ethnically cleansed the Native American and enslaved the Africans, there was complete class collaboration between the white proletariat and the well-to-do out in England. You saw the same thing happen in Australia, New Zealand, and in these other places, and as well as other Middle Eastern areas that were and Southeast Asian areas that were colonized. But in reference to the United States, class collaboration between black people, more importantly black men, and the far right is something that we hadn't seen, at least in my lifetime, I hadn't seen before. This was something new, or this is something new, and I haven't really been able to reference a time when you had a growing number of dissatisfied black males who feel that working with the far right, or working with the right, or working on behalf of these people to subvert a community of their own is something really that should be put under the lens as well. Maybe not under CRT, but under a different sort of modern Africana studies. Maybe somebody can actually write a book on that. Maybe some kind of philosopher could write a book on that. But what we're seeing now is something that in my time of growing up, I've never seen before. And so I think when they try to conflate communism and CRT, they only are scratching the surface of what they think CRT is and where it actually came from, but they never really mentioned Derek Bell. They only go to they'll go from the communists of the 1930s all the way up to Kimberly Crenshaw and completely skip over any and everybody else that was involved in the middle, especially Derek Bell, right? Who's the progenitor of, the socialization of it, right? I know there's other people that may have been involved in the focus of critical race theory, has been thought to have been done, previously, long before he was around. But in reality, I think he's the influencer behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. We had this discussion on another panel, but some of the concepts that he used obviously are going to be used and found in history prior to, but he's the one I'd say sort of created the academic movement and the header within academia where this is a legitimate ideology that's studied, practiced in law school. Studied by students in law school, as well as actually has scholarly funding for articles and things like that, and actually has an ideological following as well. It's one thing to sort of have like an informal view, but no formal theory and school of thought that goes behind it. Because I'm sure you can make the same argument for any other theory or area of academia now as well too. That essentially you had people who had concepts that were similar to this throughout the history, but one person came along and really formalized it.
Yeah. And so we get to this part right here where we get past Bell, we get past everybody else in between Crenshaw and everybody else. and we lead up to 2020, 2021, and we really start examining this and start looking at how Black people have been impacted the last presidential cycle. And if we can probably go back to Obama as well. We can look at Trayvon Martin and say, well, how did that happen, right? How is it possible that a white Latino or white Hispanic, whatever you want to call him, because he seems to identify with both where it's convenient, had the authority to pursue a teenage male, Black male, in his innocence, and violating his constitutional rights, by the way, justify shooting somebody under a law called Stand Your Ground, make it all the way to court and be found not guilty by a jury of his peers. Right? So that critical race theory and critical legal theories would actually examine all of this and put it into perspective. See, it's about having a forensic analysis on the history, past, present, and maybe future, on the system's role in impacting people on the ground who happen to be Black. And I think when you have Black men pushing back against it, saying this is not necessary for us right now, and I'm saying, but it's been around since the 1960s, if not the 70s. How can you say that it has no place right now when it's not being taught to you? It's actually very it's offered at the university level that you are not even a part of. Why are you pushing back against this?
Yeah, no, it's that's the other thing. Yeah, it's not being taught. You really can't. You could teach small concepts of it, but to have like an in-depth study of it, there's too much. You're going to have to get into legal frameworks and history and economic. It's just not something that you can really thoroughly teach at a high school level, because you're going to literally need. Teach it at a collegiate level. I would imagine this would be pretty much a semester-long course. Where you're going through, like I said, various ideologies. People have the prerequisite knowledge, to understand the economic implications of some of the things, or the legal understanding of political ideology. So it doesn't even make sense. Once again, it's something that people have weaponized. But I think the ironic part in all of this is that when you see parents and all these school board meetings where people are quote unquote pushing back against it being taught, to me, the funny thing is essentially what you're getting people saying is, hey, I don't want American history taught. I'm perfectly comfortable with history that I know is not true, is misleading, doesn't really represent true history. I'm perfectly fine with that being taught. And I ironically think that that's a good thing, in the sense of it really shows and puts on full display what the American, at least public educational system is that, there are plenty of scholars who have pointed this out. And Napoleon said history is nothing but a set of agreed upon lies. But it just really points out that, at least from the history standpoint, that the system is not designed to actually give you an education that gives you a true understanding of history, and thus you can truly understand the problems we have today. And to me, I would hope that would, I guess, in the most ideal world, would push for more Black parents to consider homeschooling their kids, or starting up schools where they have a lot more control over the curriculum. Because once again, it's clearly showing that if left to their own devices, that we'll have George Washington never told a lie, Columbus discovered America, and slaves were indentured servants. That'll be taught to your kids.
Well, that's because public education in this country has largely been used to indoctrinate people, or in regards to how they want us to see America for what it is, and white people. They don't want white people being questioned. And what critical race theory does in any sort of pro-Black initiatives and agendas do is it questions the legitimacy of white people and because their identity is being questioned. And so they don't want you bringing up, the ethnic cleansing of indigenous people. They don't want you bringing up slavery and who benefited. That was a long time ago. But these same people have no problem, becoming archaeologists and digging up bones, for dinosaurs and talking, well, this animal is 1 million years old and 20 million years old, right? But that's them trying to protect their identity, because their place within global society, not just America, is illegitimate. A social construct and a caste system projected onto people who did not want it and did not ask for it means that your place at the top of it is illegitimate, just based off of the history itself and further examinations of the systems that also have been complicit in all of this. And so how do you maintain a country if the legitimacy of whiteness, white people, and the state itself is under such scrutiny? Right? We have protests right now in Cuba, and people are saying, well, it's because of communism that this is happening. Why don't you talk about the previous administration's very aggressive policy towards Cuba itself, and how they basically put a vice grip around the throat of the state of Cuba, and why they're having all of these issues? This was bound to happen. This could be calculated. Anybody who's a political science major or a political analyst can look at the policies that were installed with the previous administration and see how this is impacting them. And so what happens here is they'll look at Cuba and say, oh, well, it's just a bunch of communists. It's run by dictators. In reality, they did have elections a couple of years ago, which is how President Miguel was actually put into power. And so their perspective is that everybody else is up for scrutiny, but not me. I'm white, but I'm not a racist. So you can't, don't call me a racist, but I'm going to have all of these sort of tropes about you and everything else that you do. It's, all of the Marxism, all the socialism, all the communism, all the isms and critical race theory, all of these things. I want to ban it all, but don't call me a racist, because my place in society is not to be questioned.
Yeah, no, that's a really key point as far as place in society, because in general, that's essentially what it does. I mean, I think by now, if you have any sort of critical thinking skills and know a little bit about history, I think anyone who has that should know that these things, that the way society is structured is illegitimate, in the sense of, hey, there are people who historically had privileges, who have gotten an advantage and then basically been able to compound that advantage. And part of what you're seeing under Trump, and as well as what you've seen going forward, has been a sense that is coming to an end. People have tried to say things like economic anxiety, but that theory has largely been disproven. It's been proven that people who were storming the Capitol were people who were well off, people who basically had the perception that they were losing status in society, and that's what this is all about. And that's when you go into the idea of talking about all this. If you can knock down this whole idea that, hey, the meritocracy and these people worked hard, and it becomes no, the system was kind of basically rigged in your favor, and let's actually level the playing field. I mean, it's over in a sense. I mean, you can just look at it like this. Look at the areas. I think it's fair to say the most meritocratic area of American life, in my opinion, is sports. Just because, okay, once you throw in the genetic factors of, hey, someone could be so big and so tall, but when you start looking at people who make that cut from a genetic standpoint, because that's always going to be a factor in anything you do. Then you're left with, okay, who trains harder, this and that. That really, to me, really sort of sets those things apart, versus when you get into other areas, it's more like connections and where you go to school and all these other things, versus, hey, playing sports. Let me be clear on that. Playing sports it is more of, hey, talent, but hard work, all those things together. So
yeah, you can't have meritocracy in the system of white supremacy. It's because it's not based on that. It's based on the in-group preference. And what critical race theory is doing is it putting the in-group, the systems that enable that in-group under the microscope, and that's where they're starting to bite their nails and become a little to that anxiety that you spoke of, not so much as economic anxiety, but societal anxiety as to where their place is within the immediate society that they've been largely upholding all this time. That's why you see all of these sort of things about putting up a wall, stop and frisk, using government resources such as law enforcement against people of color, or more importantly, black people, especially black men. That justifying Chicago, right? We should use the military against Chicago, but those people, on January 6th, and all those people coming out of Penske trucks in Philadelphia, no, we shouldn't use military against them. Just everybody else. And so, if you really think about it, they talk about small government. I'm talking about the people on the right. They talk about small government. In reality, they want the government so small that it's ineffective for everybody else, but just good enough for them. And so we have to really examine how anti-democratic they are, and what collaboration they had with what collaboration the system and the institutions have with them. If you look at emancipation, Reconstruction, what roles did those institutions play in the people, with the people, to subvert and undermine a particular demographic of people who happen to be black? How did that play out? But when you try to have that conversation with them, they don't want to have that conversation. They think that that's a stupid conversation, but in reality, that's American history. And the Library of Congress has been, the cornerstone in really keeping a lot of this documentation in place. Who owned slaves, and how many slaves were owned, and what kind of treatment did they have, and how did that play out generationally? You're talking 12 generations. Economics, capitalism. Why are black people only owning 2.5%, less than 2.5% of the nation's wealth, and over 98% of that wealth is 98% of that wealth is calcified in the hands of white people, especially white men? An inequitable system that does not believe in redistribution of resources necessary to run your society. All of those things become under the microscope, and a lot of these people who are trying to uphold CRT see the writing on the wall that right now we're in the information cold war, where one side is trying to uphold their idea of what America is, versus the other side is trying to further examine it from beyond 1776 all the way back to 1619. And so this is where we are right now. And I think it's interesting to see the class collaboration of black men working with the far right members of ideology who largely don't have any use for black people outside of a caste system structure where black people are unprivileged and at the bottom when it comes to American citizenship.
Yeah. It's the whole thing is like I said, it's the writing's on the wall, like you said, and I think part of it is once you just changing different demographics alone you're not going to be able to justify the stratification of wealth that you see. You're not going to be able to justify when you look at something like 2040, and you look at, basically there not being a majority in the country any longer. You're no longer going to be able to justify people who are white dominating all of the institutions of power in the country, be it politics, higher education, business, all arenas of influence like you've seen right now. And I mean, that's why I think you're seeing some of the push for diversity and inclusion. You're starting to see all the pushback against affirmative action and things like that, because it's such a determinant, at least in the right's mind, of higher education, that those are essentially going to be your future leaders. When you start talking about highly selective schools, the Ivy League and schools right outside the Ivy League, your public Ivies, those are basically going to produce, your future leaders of that generation of the 2040s, 2050s. And it's just not going to be able to hold. And I think that's why you're seeing this sort of attack and sort of almost like a Hail Mary attempt to try to stop time, because like you said, it's pretty much coming to an end. And like you also said, I think the high idea of black men somehow aligning with the right to sort of almost slow time down is kind of a head scratcher as well, like you said, because it's kind of like this could actually benefit you if you knew how to play your cards right, and get organized and aligned around some policy versus trying to hold on to an old order that really never benefited you to begin with.
Well, what they're aspiring to is white male chauvinism. The idea that white men have this godlike privilege over everybody else in society. We saw that with Kyle Rittenhouse, where a white male who's underage can carry a military-grade weapon and kill two people, walk through law enforcement who largely was there to deter the very people who look like you and I from exercising their First Amendment. I mean, it's insane, but that's what they're aspiring to, is white male chauvinism, the ability to actually exert their place within society against everyone else. But the only problem is that there's no record in history that shows that you're going to actually benefit from this class collaboration with far-right white males on the right, ideologically speaking. And so they see the black community as one. They see CRT and socialism and socialists and the Democratic Party, liberalism, as all one big hodgepodge of being on the left. And if they was to collaborate class-wise with the aggrieved white male, that will buy them, a place within society that is higher than that of black of leftist people, right? Because that's really what they're trying to identify, is how do we get a place in society that is above, the proletariat black male on the left, and close enough in proximity to that of white males. And as long as they can aid and abet those white males and their grievances, they believe that they'll be insulated from any sort of persecution in the end. And I think what you saw on January 6th with a couple of those black men, who were arrested and put in jail, they were like the only ones to be put in jail immediately. You're seeing that's not coming to fruition. Trump is not coming to help you. MAGA is not coming to help you. CRT is not the issue. Taking on that mantle is not going to help. It's not going to help your cause at all. In fact, it's actually hurting you in the long run, because once you go over there, I don't think you can ever come back to the left, or even have a place within the greater of society.
Yeah.
Last thoughts?
Yeah, no, I was going to quickly add on what you were mentioning on the class solidarity. Yeah, they don't realize that the reason for the white male grievance is them, even though we have all this data to show that black men are, on the bottom of society. So it's this weird paradox. As far as closing thoughts, I just think that, like I said, this is something that the writers weaponized to try to use to gin up the base, get them an issue that they're frightened of / fired up for on 2020 in 2022 to hopefully make some inroads, take back the House, hold on to the Senate, or try to, I guess, technically take back the Senate as well too, as well as see if that translates into some energy going forward in 2024, as well as I think it serves the purpose as well of shutting down discussions, like I said, about racial inequality and racial discussions in society, because you also have to look at the context of, hey, after George Floyd, all of these things were basically under examination in society. And, I'm sure that triggered a bunch of people as far as, A, they didn't like George Floyd because you heard the comments, and then B, as far as the actual response, some of the initiatives, things, equity, whether those things were just window dressing or not, the things that they've seen roughly the year since, the George Floyd incident, it's a way to sort of shut down any sort of greater discussion and make sure, okay, sort of shut off the spigot. Okay, people got Juneteenth, they got some, pledges for equity. Like, let's stop here. Let's not let people start talking about historically and systemic racism and other things.
I think that's a good place to end it. Like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at brothers_podcast.